The Subcommittee on Information Technology. I was like, yeah, okay, you know. Is there a way we can deal with that? Okay. So without objection, how about this? So without objection, the chair is authorized. 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 Well, at least we're not going to have to deal with getting interrupted by votes.
No.
Sure. Welcome, everyone. We do not have an echo. So let's try that again. The Subcommittee on Information Technology will come to order, and without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. Good morning. For more than 40 years, the U.S. has encouraged China to develop its own economy and take its place alongside the U.S. as a central and responsible player on the world stage. But China does not want to join us. They want to replace us. More importantly, China has not been playing fair. They coerce American companies into entering into joint ventures with Chinese companies with close links to the communist Chinese government as the price for market access. The United States Trade Representative, which led a 7-month investigation into China's intellectual property theft, recently found that Chinese theft of American IP currently costs between $225 billion and $600 billion annually. The Chinese have not been secretive about their ambitions and their goals. Chinese President Xi made it clear upon taking office that his dream for China is, and I quote, the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. Critical to Xi's vision of a rejuvenated China is dominance in manufacturing, modern advanced technology. In 2015, China's State Council introduced the Made in China 2025 initiative with the aim to modernize the Chinese economy and become the world leader in manufacturing. Made in China 2025 focuses on promoting breakthroughs in critical sectors of Chinese economy. And of the sectors, this hearing will focus primarily on next generation IT, a topic that this subcommittee has been exploring for 3.5 years. Next generation IT includes the hardware that make up today's technology and the networks that support communications. Examples include 5G networks, semiconductors, cloud computing, artificial intelligence, blockchain, and quantum computing. As we explore these issues, we cannot lose sight of the many abuses the oppressive Chinese government perpetuates on its citizens. In China today, Uyghur Muslims are sentenced to years in prison for praying. Mothers and fathers are shipped to re-education camps for practicing Falun Gong and never heard from again. The communist Chinese government oversees one of the strictest online censorship regimes in the world, and the Human Rights Watch recently stated the broad and sustained offensive on human rights that started after President Xi Jinping took power 5 years ago shows no sign of abating. The UN estimates as many as 1 million Chinese citizens are currently quarantined in concentration camps. The Communist Party that runs the Chinese government is an oppressive regime with an abysmal human rights record. As Americans, we believe everyone has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The millions of men, women, and children living under the oppressive Chinese regime in China deserve better from their government. Our nation faces a great challenge rising from the east, but we've met greater challenges before, and I'm confident we can meet this one. And I'm also looking to explore how we do other things than tariffs. How do we put a regime in place that deals with the practices that we know China is doing? They're stealing our technology. They are forcing intellectual transfer. Alibaba is treated like a U.S. company in the U.S., but are American companies treated like Chinese company in China? No. We know China prevents investment in key future sectors, but we allow Chinese investment in those sectors here in the U.S. I think there are other tactics we can be taking other than tariffs in order to deal with and ensure America and American companies specifically stay the leaders in innovation, and I'm looking forward to exploring these issues today. And as always, I'm excited to explore these issues with the one and only, my friend and colleague, Robin Kelly from the great state of Illinois. I thank our witnesses for being here today and look forward to hearing from them innovative solutions to ensure that America remains the world leader in advanced technologies and innovation. And now it's my pleasure to recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, Ms. Kelly, for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling today's important hearing, and I too want to welcome the witnesses. China is mounting a serious challenge to the United States for global leadership in technology and innovation. China's success so far is attributed to two policies. China uses pressure tactics on American companies, requiring them to transfer technology to Chinese firms as a condition of doing business in the Chinese market. And China is making world-leading investments in research and development. In fact, for the first time, Chinese investment in R&D will surpass U.S. investment next year. Together, these policies have transformed China into America's chief global competitor in advanced technology. Unfortunately, this administration's response has been to start a trade war with China with few results to show for it. Tariffs will not stop China from making huge investments in research and development, but tariffs are hurting Americans. Farmers are already feeling the effects. Soybean farmers in my home state of Illinois, which we are #1 in soybean, are losing out on contracts in China, and workers have been laid off as a result. American shoppers will soon feel the effects. A recent study by the National Retail Federation estimates that the most recent round of tariffs will cost U.S. consumers $6 billion in higher costs for products like furniture and luggage. The Consumer Technology Association estimates that tariffs on technology products will cost Americans another $3 billion for devices such as modems. On top of the counterproductive tariffs, the Trump administration's immigration policies are damaging our ability to compete for the talent we need to remain a leader in technology innovation. The administration recently announced that it was rescinding employment authorization for technology workers' spouses under the H-4 visa program. That sends a clear message that highly skilled immigrants who come to work for American technology companies are not welcome. And President Trump has not led the major increases in R&D investment and education funding that are necessary to stay ahead of China's commitments. Over the past 3 years, China has outspent the United States by approximately $24 billion on investments in telecommunications infrastructure. China is planning to invest an additional $400 billion over the next 5 years to win the race to deploy 5G wireless technology for cell phones. The United States is falling behind. China has already deployed 350,000 cell sites for 5G, while the U.S. has only deployed 30,000. Overall, while the U.S. remains a leader in spending on research and development, China is expected to surpass the U.S. in total research spending by the end of this year. China is also catching up to the United States in education. According to the National Science Foundation, China now awards nearly as many doctorates in science and engineering as the United States. Expanding STEM education is key for America to remain a leader in innovation in the global economy. To that end, I've introduced today's American Dream Act to incentivize college graduates with degrees in a STEM field to teach for 5 years. This legislation would help the United States build the pipeline necessary to educate the next generation of innovators in science and technology. President Trump has gotten the U.S. into a trade war with China, which is harming American farmers and businesses. This trade war lacks a clear strategy with no end in sight. The United States should be investing in research and in education to preserve America's global leadership in technology and attract the best talents from around the world. Again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to discuss this extremely important topic with our panel. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member, and I agree. Education, immigration, 2 ways we can solve this problem. And now it's a pleasure to introduce our witnesses. First, Mr. John Neufer, President and CEO of the Semiconductor Industry Association. Thank you for being here. Mr. Dean Cheng, Senior Research Fellow, Asian Studies Center, Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy at the Heritage Foundation. Say that 3 times fast. Ms. Sarah Cook, Senior Research Analyst for East Asia at Freedom House, and Rob Atkinson, President of the Information Technology Innovation Foundation. Welcome to you all, and pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses will be sworn in before you testify, so please stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. Please let the record reflect that all witnesses answered in the affirmative. In order to allow time for discussion, please limit your testimony to 5 minutes. The entire written statement has been made part of the record, and thank you for your submissions. Reminder, the clock in front of you shows remaining time. When it is yellow, you have 30 seconds. When it's red, your 5 minutes is up. Please remember to press the button to turn your microphone on before speaking. And now it is a pleasure to recognize Mr. Neufer for your opening remarks.
Thank you. I work for Tech Association, and I'm glad to see we're not the only ones that have technical difficulties with our equipment. Good morning, Chairman Hurd, Ranking Member Kelly, and members of this subcommittee. I'm John Neufer, and I'm testifying on the behalf of the Semiconductor Industry Association. Thanks for the opportunity to testify before this committee regarding one of the most pressing challenges facing the U.S. semiconductor industry today: how to maintain U.S. semiconductor technology leadership in light of the full-throated effort by China to compete with the U.S. in advanced technologies, especially in regard to those Chinese government policies and practices that threaten our intellectual property and distort markets. Invented right here in America, semiconductors are the building blocks upon which U.S. technological leadership rests. They power virtually all modern electronics, from communications to transportation to healthcare to energy to military systems. U.S. chip makers lead the world. We account for close to half of the $412 billion global semiconductor market. We are the nation's 4th largest exporter after aircraft, refined oil, and automobiles. We have a global trade surplus of over $6 billion and a bilateral trade surplus with China of over $2 billion. Importantly, nearly half of our manufacturing operations are right here in America, spread across 19 states, not just in Silicon Valley. And the industry employs close to 25,000 workers in the U.S. with well-paying jobs. So China is a critical market for our industry, to be sure. At the center of the world's electronics supply chain, China is, unsurprisingly, the leading destination for U.S. semiconductor exports. We are especially concerned with Chinese actions, policies, and practices that force the transfer or allow the outright theft of our technology. This includes the forced transfer of our technology as a condition of market access, which you've addressed this morning, the plethora of formal and informal requirements that force the disclosure of intellectual property, and persistent economic espionage to steal valuable IP. In 2014, China is set in motion a massive effort to indigenize its semiconductor ecosystem, with the goal of becoming the global leader in all major segments of the industry by 2030. Core to this effort are substantial government subsidies. Altogether, an estimated $900 to $100 billion in government financial support has been earmarked to support this sweeping undertaking. Similar Chinese industrial policies in sectors such as solar, wind, and LEDs have led to major distortions in the marketplace and left lots of wreckage. So we know what that picture show looks like. To maintain U.S. leadership in the semiconductor industry, the U.S. government must develop a comprehensive and adequately resourced competitiveness and innovation agenda. Other steps need to be taken. First, let's eliminate tariffs, the recently imposed tariffs on semiconductors. Slapping tariffs on our products only hurts U.S. semiconductor companies while failing to address the real problems we're having with China. Chinese semiconductor companies don't even send their products to the U.S., so Chinese enterprises are not hurt by tariffs. Second, strengthen multilateral actions with U.S. allies. Multilateral pressure is one of the few tactics that has historically prompted China to change course in a positive direction. Third, strengthen protection of IP. Press harder on China to adopt policies and engage in stronger IP enforcement to prohibit and penalize state or state-owned enterprises from misappropriating trade secrets or proprietary technologies generally, and especially through activities related to the hiring of overseas talent. Finally, help the U.S. run faster with increased federal investment in research. While the U.S. has long been the leader in semiconductor R&D, federal investment in this area is simply not keeping pace with nation-state competitors. The United States is at a critical juncture. It's facing intense global competition from China in multiple high-tech sectors, including semiconductors. While our nation continues to dominate leading technologies from semiconductors to aerospace, we must not be complacent. There are real near-term and long-term challenges that require closer collaboration between industry and government to ensure we retain our technological leadership in key technology arenas. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Chang, you're now recognized for your opening remarks.
Good morning, Chairman Hurd, Ranking Member Kelly, members of the subcommittee and committee. My name is Dean Chang. I'm the Senior Research Fellow for Chinese Political and Security Affairs at the Heritage Foundation. My comments this morning are my own. My comments this morning are intended to provide some context for better understanding the Chinese approach to information and information technology. Three key aspects underlie the Chinese view of the world, and in particular their approach to information and communications technology: comprehensive national power, the period of strategic opportunity, and the impact of living in the information age. Comprehensive national power is how the Chinese compare the world's various nations. How do they rack and stack Bolivia, Botswana, Brazil, the United States? It includes all aspects of national power: military capability, economic capacity, political unity, diplomatic respect, even cultural security. Science and technology writ large, but especially information technology, contributes to and affects all of these aspects of comprehensive national power. It improves the economy, enhances military effectiveness, and can even elevate cultural security and strengthen political unity. It's also important to recognize that in the Chinese context, scientists and the scientific community often have an outsized political impact. And I would point to the example of the Chinese scientist Qian Xuesen, who was a combination of J. Robert Oppenheimer, Albert Einstein, and Robert Goddard in the Chinese context, and had enormous political influence. The period of strategic opportunity is, from the Chinese perspective, the first 2 decades of the 21st century. It is a period marked by a low probability of war, and therefore an important moment for China to focus on national development, to elevate GDP, GDP per capita, level of national infrastructure, and again, level of science and technology capacity. Exploiting the period of strategic opportunity is central because it will allow China to catch up with the rest of the world, and will include both internal domestic efforts as well as exploiting ties to the outside world. And here the fact that we live in the information age becomes central, because the rise of the information age facilitates China's access to the rest of the world's R&D capacity, but also provides a focus for China's internal development. The rise of the information age means that future power is going to be measured not simply in industrial capacity. How many gigawatts of power do you produce? How many millions of tons of bauxite do you refine? But in terms of the ability to generate, to gather, to analyze, to exploit, and to transmit information more rapidly and more accurately, both within China but around the world. And so within this context, information and communications technology, ICT, plays an especially outsized role given its impact as the basic metric for future power. It should therefore not be surprising then that China is focused on developing information, not just ICT as we tend to think of it, whether it's semiconductors or 5G, but ancillary and related aspects: software, social media, even space. Space is seen as a vital part of information technology because it is a central means of both transmitting and gathering information. Again, it should not be a surprise that for the Chinese, of particular emphasis is so-called ABC: artificial intelligence, big data, and cloud computing. In each of these areas, the Chinese are pushing their state champions. It should be noted these are not necessarily state-owned enterprises, but all Chinese companies at the end of the day are state-influenced. and therefore may not be directly working for China, but are certainly not going to say no the way Google has over Project Maven. The Chinese do see all of this information revolution as fundamentally altering the state of play among nations. Much like HMS Dreadnought instantly made all warships around the world obsolete, the Chinese believe that ICT is providing an opportunity to, in a sense, reset the global balance of power. In this context, however, I do want to emphasize to the members of the committee that the Chinese are not simply stealing. This is not, of course, to say that they don't steal, but that they have spent an enormous amount of effort and energy to promote indigenous innovation, and therefore it would be a horrible mistake for us to believe that if we simply could curtail theft, that China will inevitably fall behind. You cannot look at the amount of sustained effort and investment and believe that China is going to allow itself to fall behind. Let me conclude then with just a couple of quick thoughts on solutions, one of which is that if the issue is about stolen technology, then we should perhaps treat Chinese companies as dealing in stolen goods. And we have an extensive legal array of measures to deal with that. If it is about information, however, then for China, it is as much about information access as it is about the information goodness itself. Thank you very much.
Ms. Cook, you're now recognized for your opening remarks.
Chairman Hurd, Ranking Member Kelly, and members of the subcommittee, thank you. It is an honor to testify. Last fall, the Chinese Communist Party declared its aspirations for China to become a, quote, cyber superpower. A September 2017 article in a top party journal lays out China's strategy for achieving this status and is surprisingly candid about the party's ambitions and motives, including 1, increasing domestic Chinese internet controls to ensure authoritarian longevity, so that, quote, the party's ideas always become the strongest voice in cyberspace, end quote. 2, using the technology sector as a foundation to secure China's economic health, including by enhancing the global influence of Chinese tech giants. And 3, expanding information controls beyond China's borders in order to, quote, push China's proposition of internet governance toward becoming an international consensus, end quote. Prioritization and effective implementation of such strategies has emerged as a hallmark of Xi Jinping's leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. Xi has a sophisticated understanding of how the internet and social media applications function, and he's proven himself adept at closing previously existing loopholes in internet controls. Indeed, over the past year alone, China has taken new strides in technological advancement, censorship, surveillance, and international expansion. The Communist Party's cyber ambitions directly and negatively impact U.S. companies. China is home to over 800 million internet users, but many of the world's top technology and social media firms are banned or extremely constrained in their ability to provide services to them, including Facebook, Twitter, and Google. A 2016 survey by the American Chamber of Commerce found that 79% of U.S. companies reported that Chinese government internet restrictions hurt their businesses. Chinese technology firms have been at the forefront of the party's censorship and surveillance efforts, but American and international firms are increasingly implicated. The Chinese government is adept at using the combination of its ability to block online services and the lure of its enormous domestic market to extract concessions from foreign firms, including assistance with its censorship and surveillance system. Under China's new cybersecurity law, foreign companies operating in China are also increasingly at risk of becoming complicit in politicized arrests. As Chinese and foreign companies take more steps to appease the regime, the human toll will continue to mount. Censorship and surveillance on sensitive topics like Taiwan, Tibet, Xinjiang, and Falun Gong either whitewash or actually exacerbate large-scale human rights violations, including mass detentions, torture, and extrajudicial killings. Ironically, the complicit companies are also victims of the government's repression. They suffer from the arbitrary nature of Chinese regulatory decisions, reduced profit margins, and distrust abroad due to close Chinese government ties. China and the Communist Party's cyberspace policies and strategies are complex and multi-layered. They require an equally sophisticated response. I would urge the committee to consider the following recommendations. 1, the United States should be proactive in developing its own capabilities and upholding international free speech and privacy standards. This should include developing a comprehensive 5 to 10-year national strategy on artificial intelligence. 2, the United States government should encourage the business community to take a principled stance vis-a-vis Chinese government internet controls. This should include reintroducing and passing the Global Online Freedom Act, which would designate internet restricting countries and impose certain requirements on companies doing business in those places. And 3, the United States should be proactive in challenging the very clear authoritarian foundations of the Communist Party's cyberspace strategy. A central pillar of this effort should be increasing both the scale and effectiveness of funding for countering censorship efforts specifically related to China. The Chinese government is spending billions of dollars a year, not only to keep Chinese people from freely accessing the internet, but also to keep U.S. companies from offering services to the largest internet market in the world. Some of the first websites Chinese users visit after jumping the so-called Great Firewall are actually sites like Google, Facebook, and Twitter. Supporting Chinese internet users' ability to access these websites not only enhances internet freedom, but also U.S. economic competitiveness. In this context, I urge the committee to investigate and report on whether current U.S. government funding for internet freedom in China is being deployed in the most effective manner to address today's challenges. This would involve seeking information from the Broadcasting Board of Governors and the State Department on questions such as how much internet freedom funding has been allocated to China, how many users in China have benefited, does this appropriately match the needs and demands of users as well as U.S. interests and policy goals vis-a-vis China? Funding efforts to date have undoubtedly done much good, but there is reason to believe that an even greater impact could be achieved with a more efficient strategy, possibly without the need to even increase funding. American and international firms are caught between a rock and a hard place. The Chinese Communist Party has laid out its own plans and ambitions, and it shows every sign of implementing them to the fullest. The question is whether the United States, other democracies, and tech entrepreneurs will assert their own principles, including freedom of expression, with equal determination. Thank you.
Mr. Atkinson, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Hurd and Ranking Member Kelly and members of the subcommittee. It's a pleasure to be here today. ITIF is a technology policy think tank. We've long focused on the question of what we've termed innovation mercantilism from China. I won't go into the details of what that is. I put that in my written testimony. Let me say, what should we be doing? Clearly, the avenue now is tariffs. I'm not going to say whether they're overall good or bad, but I think if we're going to use tariffs, we should use them strategically. Mr. Neufer alluded to the fact that tariffs on semiconductors only hurt us. They don't help, they don't hurt the Chinese. We put tariffs on certain types of products or inputs where the American firm is competing against, say, a firm from Japan or a firm from Indonesia. They come into the country tariff-free. Our companies don't. If we're going to use tariffs, let's be strategic about it. Let's put some thought behind it and not just use it as a blunt instrument. I think more importantly, though, we need to think about how do we orient trade policy towards China in a results-oriented way. This is something people argued about with regard to Japan in the 1980s. What are the results we want from China? I say that, by the way, because I don't think a process-oriented process works with China. They're just too sophisticated, and any time we say don't do a particular process, they'll figure out a new way to do it. I think we want a number of clear, easily measured results. One, an end to coerced and forced tech transfer. We can measure that. We can say just no more. Secondly, a vast reduction of industrial subsidies, as again Mr. Neufer alluded to. They're not just in the semiconductor industry, they're in a vast array of technology industries, way, way beyond what the OECD subsidy guidelines would allow. A reduction in IP theft and cyber theft, and much better U.S. market access. So how do we do that? I think it's clear that our best chance of doing that is a deep, deep coalition with our allies. We've had meetings with the Japanese, with the European officials, with Korean officials. They all ask for one thing, for us to take the lead, but they all want to be part of that. And I think right now we're not doing that. We've seen that process works. Back in I'm going to guess 2012 or so, there was a Chinese policy called Indigenous Innovation Product Catalogs, very onerous, restrictive process. You couldn't sell to the Chinese if you were a European or American firm unless you gave them your technology. That was essentially it. The Europeans, their Chamber of Commerce, our Chamber of Commerce, our governments, their government, all banded together, and that pressure was enough to force the Chinese government to back off and eliminate the Indigenous Innovation Product Catalog. So we've seen that that way of organizing pressure works. If we don't do that, though, what do we need to do? I think a big part of this is going to basically be making their ability to catch up more difficult. We're just going to have to throw roadblocks in the way while at the same time speeding up our catch-up. And part of that has to be limiting their global market share and expanding our global market share. Technology industries is probably one of the most important things you can do because global market share means more revenues to then invest in R&D. And in that regard, I would say that having a company like Google go into China is completely in the American interest, even if they comply with Chinese law. We want to take market share away from Baidu. We want to give our companies more market share. What else can we do? I think we need a better and more comprehensive ability to understand what's going on. That's why we've supported the Senate Bill S2757, the National Economic Security Strategy Act, which would call for an economic strategy aligned with national security for the first time in our history. We would encourage the House to adopt something similar. We certainly would encourage the administration to take a hard line on Chinese investment. FIRMA certainly helps on that. But you see this now, for example, there are Chinese-backed technology accelerators. There's one in University of Maryland, for example. These aren't out of the goodness of the heart of the Chinese government. These are designed for only one purpose, to support new firms, new high-tech startup firms, and to take their technology across the ocean back to China. We need to have USTR bring a case before the WTO on subsidy disclosure, which they have not done. This is actually an area where the WTO might be able to actually act against Chinese interests as opposed to some other areas where it's much more difficult. I would work hard to ban Chinese access to our Chinese firm access to our banking system, our security system. They don't give us that. We need to rethink antitrust. For example, right now we have a regulation that our Justice Department exempts mergers at state-owned enterprises in China. There's no reason to do that. We should be holding them accountable for antitrust the way they have used their process against us. And finally, even with all the efforts we need to be taking to slow them down and put roadblocks in front of them for their unfair actions, we need to take stronger actions at home, increased R&D, Ex-Im Bank funding, better STEM talent, better R&D tax credit, and the like. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Now I'd like to recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Issa, for his opening rounds of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And what wasn't said in this open hearing is much of what you know about directly about China's espionage and their effort, successful effort, to gain huge amounts of technology by stealing it systematically over the last probably 4 presidents. So this is a bipartisan problem. I'm going to start with Mr. Nuffer. You said something, look, I come from your industry. We go back a long way. I watched us systematically sell out to the Chinese. I watched us systematically move our fabs to China. Now, I appreciate your discussion of exports, but exports and imports, we could net them, and that statistic would probably disappear. But I think the important question is, isn't one of the effects, positive effects, of the tariff the fact that virtually every one of your member companies, if they are exclusively in China, are looking for a second location, either a U.S. location, if they don't already have one, but even if they do, they're likely looking at the Philippines, South Korea, any number of other places. So I'm not here to defend, and I'd like a short answer of the fact, isn't it true that the current activity is causing your companies to second guess having all or most of their fabs, at least for some product lines, in China?
Great question. First of all, just as a percentage of our global production around the world, the amount of production we do in China is quite small.
How many fabs does
know
Intel have in California, by the way?
I don't know the
answer is 0. So I appreciate you're talking about Silicon Valley,
well,
but your industry left California for the most part because of unreliable sourcing of electricity and water. Isn't one of the challenges that we have to be more business-friendly in the U.S. for at least those two assets, or we're not going to bring those fab plants back here?
So I agree that we need to be more business-friendly, and this is something that we've talked about a lot.
Okay, well, this administration's accomplishing that part, but could you just answer the short one? Isn't it true that your members are, as a result of the current situation with China, actively looking and moving, if possible, assets that they've been producing in China to at least have a second source outside of China?
I'm not going to second guess what's happening in the board.
Okay, then
boardrooms of
if
my
you're not,
members,
if you're,
but
well,
my
no, I
answer is-
was talking about action. I just came back from Beijing.
my
I was
answer is-
there for 4 days,
answer
and
is-
yes, they are.
I don't think so.
Okay, well, unfortunately, your counterparts in China made it very clear to me that that's what's happening on the ground. You know, I'm hearing a systematic tariffs don't work. I'm going to ask a question, and I'll go over to the other end and ask this question. You said in your opening comments or remarks that that Google should go into China. I'll paraphrase Ronald Reagan's quote when he was talking about people who gave him money. Somebody questioned whether the contribution that Ronald Reagan got from some group tainted him, and he said, "People who give me money don't sign on to. I don't sign on to their values; they sign on to mine." Isn't it true that if Google goes into China, complies with Chinese regulations, effectively they become a Chinese company? So is there really a net gain if you have to play by Chinese rules? And I'll just give you the example. If I go into Africa and I ignore the Foreign Corruption Practices Act, don't I become an African company and essentially lose my U.S. identity?
So, to be clear, I said what I intended to say. If I didn't say it, was I think we should support or not criticize Google if they want to go into China. If they want to go into China,
But you said they should comply with, Ms. Cook, he said
Yes.
specifically they should comply with the Chinese rules. In other words, they should change to fit an unfair trade partner. Ms. Cook, you seem to have a comment on that.
I think in
Or
those
Ms. Code, I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Or Cook, no, it is.
Cook, yeah.
You can tell my glasses need to be put on.
I think that the question that the issue Mr. Atkinson raised related to market share, and I think we're deceiving ourselves if we think that the Chinese government, with its indigenous innovation policies, promoting global giants like Baidu, is really going to let Google get any kind of
Well,
serious
and let me
market share.
ask a closing
So you're
question.
compromising your values, sorry.
The Chinese premier at the World Economic Forum made a speech that any Republican would be proud of, talking about lowering the burden, tax cuts, and so on. But he also said that, in fact, his tax cuts were going to have to replace subsidizing, that he could not subsidize his economy back into working. Does anyone here really believe that they're going to stop the subsidies that are absolutely pushed toward their indigenous companies and even away from our companies if they're operating in China? Hopefully this is an easy one. Mr. Atkinson.
their subsidies, I would argue, are WTO illegal, many of them. And if we brought a case,
We do have cases in the WTO and have for some time, along with the Europeans.
not on overall catalog subsidy disclosures. Under the WTO accession agreement, they were supposed to do that every 6 months. They haven't done it.
Okay, the chairman's going to take back the time because he should. I'm going to close just by saying that what I like about the WTO process is that it gives plenty of time for people to think about it because it's slow as can be. Thank you.
Thank you, Daryl. Now I'd like to recognize Ms. Kelly for her first round of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Atkinson, your organization released a report in March 2018 on the impact of tariffs on the United States economy. In your report, you wrote, ITIF estimates that a 10% tariff levied on Chinese information and communication technology imports would slow the growth of U.S. output by $163 billion over the next 10 years, and a 25% tariff would slow output by $332 billion. You argue that, and I quote, applying tariffs would needlessly harm the U.S. economy, and then just last week, the administration imposed tariffs on $250 billion of Chinese imports. How will last week's tariffs affect the U.S. economy?
we haven't done a thorough analysis of all the tariff lines in that $250 billion, but clearly, I think it's important to differentiate between what are called producer goods and consumer goods. So if you put a tariff on shoes, let's say, the impact is someone has to pay more for shoes. If you put an impact on a machine or a piece of software or a device that a company or an organization uses or the federal government uses to become more innovative and more productive, we're going to slow down innovation and productivity. So there are a number of products in that new regime of the $250 billion that would do that, and the result would be slower productivity and innovation in the U.S. because of that.
Okay. And then you said that you weren't going to say, I'm paraphrasing, quotes are good or bad, but if used, they just need to be used strategically. And I was back to the WTO. I have steel industry in my community, and they go to the WTO often to settle dumping or low prices and things like that. And I don't know, it seems like in listening to them, I don't know, maybe it's effective, but as someone said, it's so slow. But they are extremely frustrated. And what do you think in this field, how, do you think it would really be effective and efficient? Or I don't get that impression from some of my steel people.
Sure. This is why I argue we need to treat China differently with regard to trade policy. So in most other countries, we have a process-oriented trade policy. If they violate something, there's a judicial process called the WTO. There's negotiations. We go through that. Yes, it's a little bit slow. It generally works. And it deals with the fact that many countries, including the U.S., have some protectionist policies for other reasons. China's different, and that's why really fundamentally I don't buy the notion that the WTO alone can solve this problem. I use that as one example of something we should do, but it's got to be part of a much broader arsenal, if you will, because the Chinese know how to play, they know how to play the WTO to their advantage. One of the key advantages they have is they don't have written rules and laws. So to go to the WTO and win, we point to a law in Argentina that says X, and we can win that case. But there's no law in China on tech transfer, and therefore they deny it. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen. It happens through administrative guidance and forcing in a meeting that you have to do this. It's harder to prosecute those in the WTO.
Okay. So we need a lot of tools in the toolbox. Mr. Neufer? When President Trump announced tariffs last month, he included the semiconductors from China as one of the products, and you stated at that time, and I quote, that the semiconductors imported, like you said today, from China will hurt American chip makers, not China's, and will do nothing to stop China's problematic and discriminatory trade practices. How do tariffs on imports from China hurt American chip makers?
Thanks for that question. Just want to set the record straight from a question from Representative Issa. Just want to underscore that 50% of our production is still here in the U.S. And while most of manufacturing in the U.S. started in California, over the years it's spread out through the country. Like I said, 19 states. Intel, for example, has massive fabs in Oregon and Arizona
And Texas.
New York, and in Texas. Exactly. So it was just a natural maturing of the industry. And I also want to state for the record that if you look at American companies' global fab production, quite a small portion of that is done in China. Most of it is done in the U.S. and other parts of the world. As for your question, thank you. The reality is the tariffs on semiconductors only hit U.S. semiconductor makers and makers of our allies like Japan, Taiwan, and Korea. The semiconductors, most of our semiconductors we make that go to China, that go there for some back-end, low-value assembly, test, and packaging. Basically, take these wafers, you chop them up, you test them, you put them in these little things with leads. That's low-value stuff that adds about 10% of the value. Some of those chips come back here. Some go to other parts of the world. So it's the ones that come back here that get hit with the tariff. Chinese semiconductor manufacturers sell almost all of their chips in China, and none or almost no chips to the U.S. So while we applaud the administration's effort to try to shut down the forced tech transfer and shut down the illegal theft of IP that we're having with China. This is just a very blunt tool, and the semiconductor industry has got caught in the dragnet, and it's us getting hurt by this, and it's not building leverage on the Chinese to potentially draw them to the negotiating table to get other outcomes.
Are they aware of this, that it hurts, it doesn't help in
The
your
administration,
particular?
I believe so.
Okay. One common stipulation for American companies doing business in China, as has been talked about, is forcing them to engage in joint ventures or technology sharing. What are the dangers of a Chinese company with connections to the Communist Party appropriating American technology through joint ventures or other business deals? And is there real concern that American technology could be reverse engineered for military use?
Yeah, these are all real concerns for sure. Joint ventures, we do them all over the world. We do them here, we do them in China. The thing to keep in mind is, we have regimes in place through export control that ensure that sensitive technologies do not seep out into regimes like China. And our companies are very careful about adhering to those export control regimes. The other piece of this is IP has been the lifeblood. Intellectual property, process technology has been the lifeblood of the semiconductor industry. The leaders of these companies are obsessive with trying to ensure that IP stays in their companies, because if it ends up outside of their companies, their business disappears.
Can I
Thank
go
you.
on? Sure. Okay. We all agree China must be held accountable for IP theft and other unfair trade practices, but it's very concerning that this trade war is escalating and causing real harm to Americans. Can the members of the panel describe what the effects of full-blown trade war would be for the technology industry in the United States? And whoever wants to start is fine.
Sure. So I think there's only two things that can happen out of this. One is eventually the Chinese will give. They'll cry uncle and they'll come to the negotiating table. I am still, I don't want to say I'm optimistic, but I'm open-minded to that. I really think that's a possibility. So we don't know what's going to happen. The other possibility is they just dig their heels in and they say, forget it, we're never going to do this. And then the question for the U.S. becomes, do we really want to have a really bifurcated global trading system, almost going back to the Cold War era where you had a communist bloc that traded with itself and a non-communist bloc. I think the cost of that would be quite significant for the U.S. Would be in two kinds of costs. One would be transition costs, so companies would have to move their facilities out of China. And we should be realistic, the vast majority of them are not coming to the U.S. They went there for a reason, oftentimes cost. So they would go to places like Vietnam, or as Mr. Issa said, the Philippines, or maybe India, or places like that. So I don't think it's not like we're going to get much back. The other thing would be companies are there for a reason, and so if they have to go somewhere else, the costs will go up. And that would end up, again, hurting our ability to be global leaders, because some of those products we sell in third markets. Mm-hmm. And so there's very good research on this that shows that when U.S. technology companies sell overseas, even when they don't produce that, a lot of those benefits come back to the United States in the form of high-wage jobs, of designers, of R&D folks, of marketing, of sales, and all of that. So we depend a lot on our economy on jobs that where the manufacturing isn't here. And so if we lose some of that because we have to have higher prices over, let's say, the Japanese or the Germans or something, it could hurt U.S. jobs.
Thank you.
Tariffs are a little bit outside of my usual area of expertise, but I think I would just mention that, if we're looking at the costs that the Chinese government's internet censorship, especially the Great Firewall, imposes on on U.S. companies, they already actually, it's a huge act of protectionism, essentially, that cost billions and billions of dollars. I mean, the reason companies like Google consider sacrificing their values is because they think they're going to be able to get access to 800 million internet users, that almost triple the population of the entire United States. So I think, again, I'm not sure trade wars and tariffs are necessarily the answer, but I think it is worth keeping in mind that the starting point right now in the sector of online services is that the Chinese government has imposed an enormous and very costly restriction that has huge economic implications, not just human rights implications, on U.S. companies. So I think anything the U.S. could do, again, I'm not sure tariffs are necessarily the answer, to counter that is a good, including funding the scaling up of circumvention tools to allow more Chinese people to access these services without having to get the approval of the Chinese Communist Party. Gives leverage in other areas of negotiation as well, and it could be a very important investment of taxpayer money. So it's a little bit of a different perspective.
Like Ms. Cook, I'm not a trade specialist, but I would suggest that there are several questions that need to be answered in order to address the representative's question. For example, I think that when it turned out that banning sales of all U.S. inputs to ZTE would effectively kill that company, that came almost certainly as a surprise to Chinese decision makers, probably to even some American decision makers. It highlights the lack of clarity regarding actual vulnerabilities in Chinese companies. Now, let me emphasize, this is not an argument for tariffs whatsoever. What it is an argument for is a desperate need for us to better understand how supply chains work in both directions. What are actual Chinese vulnerabilities, whether in the IT realm or perhaps in the petrochemical realm, in land reclamation, which has implications for the South China Sea? Because it may well be that there are more Chinese vulnerabilities in less identified key subsectors than is generally widely recognized. The other question that remains also unclear is the Made in China 2025 program, which is to say, what happens if China actually succeeds? We are here concerned about the potential impact of American tariffs on the global trade system, and that's a very reasonable question. But do we think that if China succeeds in truly becoming self-sufficient in key IT areas, that China will all of a sudden then say, but we support a global trading system? Or will they now be insulated, like their information ecology and environment, behind an industrial equivalent of a great firewall, to basically say, now that we're safe, bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Can I take a shot at that?
Sure.
That question, thank you. So just again, for us, tariffs on us is puzzling because Chinese company enterprises don't send semiconductors to the U.S., so there's no leverage built. The other thing I'd like to say is 80% of our sales are overseas, China and other markets. Our customers are overseas, like most American companies, multinational companies. So anything that depresses trade is a risk for us financially, commercially. We do hope that these tariffs draw the Chinese to the negotiating table so we can get some beneficial outcomes. But until we get to that point, we're all at risk of hurting our economies. After that, we hope if they come to the negotiating table, they get strong outcomes, all great. But if they don't come to the negotiating table and we don't get strong outcomes, where do we go from here? So a lot of questions about this. One thing we have been looking at in particular is what these tariffs do to IT spend. So tech products become more expensive, so IT spend becomes more expensive. And if IT spend is depressed, given that tech products, what do you call them, Rob? Super technology, super capital. Tech products are super capital that drive growth throughout the entire economy. If the IT spend starts dropping, that has an exponential multiplier effect throughout the entire economy, and this is something we're worried about. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'm done.
I just finished 38 town halls in 5 days, and I'm in Cotulla, Texas, which is in part of South Texas. Most people know Cotulla as part of the energy boom. And the first question I got was actually on China. And a young woman asked me, and I know this question is slightly outside of our topic today. I know we're talking about IT, but I promised this constituent that I was going to be with a bunch of smart people and I would ask this question. how did China become the manufacturer of millions of drugs that Americans take every day, right? And did they use predatory practices similar to those that we're seeing in the IT space? I just welcome if anybody have a quick answer to that. Mr. Chen, go ahead.
I'm even less of a drug person than I am a
Tariff person?
Yes, sir. But my understanding, and this is without the benefit of having stayed at Holiday Inn Express, is that China does produce a great deal of fentanyl. Fentanyl is a key component for opioids. Whether that was predatory or not is much less clear. My very, very limited understanding is that, as with these other technology areas, that it's a complex mix of domestic demand due to everything from changing views of what should be prescribed, under what circumstances, legal coverage, all those things, to the Chinese taking advantage of a market that appeared without necessarily indulging in predatory practices.
Good copy. Ms. Cook, do you have any opinions? Well, the constituent of the 23rd thanks you for that question, Mr. Ching. Project Maven, DoD contract to work with commercial companies to do artificial intelligence along moving video. Recently, Google made a fairly large statement about not participating in this project because ultimately the information that they were going to potentially identify could lead to a terrorist being identified and eventually the U.S. government doing with terrorists what we generally do, kinetic strike. The area that I haven't seen enough conversation on, now you juxtapose that with China's, or with Google's potential decision of getting involved in a search engine in China that violates, freedom of expression, right? Another value issue. The beneficiary of both of those decisions are China. You have a important American company involved on the pointy end of the spear when it comes to artificial intelligence, breaking from Department of Defense, which arguably has the most data available to train algorithms. That is a strategic win for the Chinese. Have we seen, and we know that Chinese spy agencies do everything from stealing information and trying to influence. So my question is, are we concerned, or have we experienced, or have we seen what I would call Chinese active measures? When we talk about active measures using disinformation, influence operations, we talk a lot about how the Russians are doing this. Russians try to do this in our elections. But we don't talk enough about Chinese use of active measures when it comes to achieving a strategic goal, like driving a wedge between American companies and the U.S. government. Opinions, thoughts, suggestions? I open it up. Mr. Atkinson, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, just a couple things to clarify. I actually believe that it is not in the Chinese interest to have Google come in. They're going to do whatever they want to do with information blocking. It doesn't make any difference whether they're a foreign company there or not. So I think that's in our interest, as I said before. There's a new book by a colleague of mine, Darren Tremblay, who is now at GW, who used to be in the FBI for many, many years in commercial counterintelligence. And this book is about, it just came out maybe 4 months ago, and it's a very good history of how foreign governments have used active measures against us, Russia and China. And in that book, there are many, many, many examples of how China is doing that. I can't say whether they've been doing it in the Google case that you alluded to with Project Maven, but they do that. And they use active measures, passive measures, they use all sorts of measures to try to get to influence us and our companies to make decisions that aren't in our interest.
Ms. Cook, any opinion?
I'm not privy to, I think, the kind of information that would address whether that happened in the Google case, but to echo Mr. Atkinson's comment, in general, the Chinese Communist Party uses a variety of measures to influence the United States through media, through pressures to create censorship here in the United States, through various ways of recruitment and gaining access to information. And I think I would just comment that if you flip it on its head and you look at the area of artificial intelligence, it's one of the areas where Chinese companies are emerging at the forefront, using very questionably ethical methods. A lot of the AI Chinese companies are heavily invested and have lots of government contracts in Xinjiang. And their information is essentially being used to catch Muslims to send them to re-education camps. They're able to use the massive amount of data they have access to gain a more competitive edge internationally as well, in the sense of both ethnic issues related to racial bias in artificial intelligence. They now have a contract with the Zimbabwean government that will actually turn Zimbabwean citizens' data over to a Chinese company that will allow them to further improve their algorithms. So they have access to Uyghurs who ethnically look, say, Middle Eastern or Central Asian, Chinese who look East Asian, and now Africans who Sub-Saharan Africans, that gives really potentially a competitive edge in an industry they're anticipated to take a 44% market share by 2023. One point is that one of those companies, a major investor, is actually U.S. chipmaker Qualcomm. So you have a situation where U.S. investors generally tend to reward problematic behavior like that because it can be very profitable, but also where you have U.S. companies potentially, rather than investing in U.S. artificial intelligence firms to gain a competitive edge, are investing in a Chinese firm with very questionable practices. So I think some of the recommendations related to developing a comprehensive artificial intelligence strategy, as well as something like the Global Online Freedom Act that would hold companies to certain ethical standards, could be a way of pushing back both against other restrictions, but also potentially, suspicions and other ways in which the Chinese government tries to gain influence in the U.S. Tech environment.
And then, Ms. Cook, I would agree with you that we do need a national artificial intelligence strategy. Robin and I and our teams just put out a report this week highlighting some of the things that we've learned in our various hearings on artificial intelligence. I think you and I have done half of the hearings in Congress on artificial intelligence, and I believe that's important, as well as the need for a national strategy on quantum. I would say artificial intelligence right now is dumb, but the way it's going to get smart is once we achieve quantum. And I think these two things are connected, even though the science behind both are very different. So I agree, and this is why we do these things. This suggestion, the Global Online Freedom Act, hearing about this, getting this feedback on other initiatives that are out there, is something that we're able to continue to sink our teeth in and to go. Mr. Cheng, the previous question on Chinese active measures. And I would even welcome the comments on, are U.S. companies prepared to defend against state-sponsored actors? Right? And I think I know the answer, having been in the private sector to help some companies do this, but are we seeing a recognition of all these issues that Mr. Atkinson alluded to, and probably that are mentioned in this book that was quoted? Mr. Chen.
Sir, three issues. One, the broader issue of Chinese influence operations ties into the Chinese view of political warfare. This is part of their doctrine. This is part of the specific mission set assigned to the Chinese military. It includes the so-called three warfares: public opinion warfare, which is a constant, ongoing activity, which is going on right now. It is not necessarily tied to a specific armed conflict; psychological warfare and legal warfare, manipulating both Chinese and foreign laws, regulations, treaties in order to achieve given political ends. One can imagine, in the context of both public opinion and psychological warfare, that the Chinese may well be inquiring of any foreign company do you really think we will allow you into our markets if you are participating in a potential adversary's defense contracts? Whether or not that has occurred is not open to public, open source information. I would obviously defer to those who have access to far better data on that. But I simply throw out there the Chinese doctrine, which is publicly available, talks about the importance of employing the three warfares constantly against all potential adversaries. With on the issue of Google in China, I'm afraid I need to disagree with my fellow panelists. In the first place, the presence of Google in China would be a de facto endorsement of the Chinese information environment. That a company that specifically left after Chinese attack would then re-enter would be spun in the context, again, of that public opinion warfare as proof of one of two things. Either China's market is so important that you will put up with almost anything we do to you, or two, that China's environment has improved to the point where you would voluntarily come back. As for the issue of market share, the Chinese in other areas have been very, very clear. There is a market share that they will allow you, and if you should pass that, then in that case, per Darth Vader in Empire Strikes Back, I am changing the terms of the deal, pray I do not change them further. And the way the Chinese go about this in terms of the issue of defending against attack, too often takes pathways that some take pathways that we are familiar with, direct cyber intrusion, et cetera, but particularly in the context of joint ventures and the things, they often involve, for example, staffing the HR department. If I decide who the joint venture hires, then in that case, that creates a very different set of potential vulnerabilities. The other aspect here is whether or not companies themselves recognize. I think IT companies, ICT companies, semiconductor companies may well be aware of the vulnerabilities that are entailed. Banking companies are very much aware of the need to protect information. But it's the mid-sized company that feels it has to go into China, that often has a small IT department to begin with, that is far more likely to therefore say, well, but we do mid-level chemicals, we do paints, we do agricultural seedlings. Why would the Chinese attack us? I mean, obviously, if we're a major defense contractor, of course they'll go after them. But why would they go after the makers of new headlamps? That the Chinese have this voracious maw for all types of IP is sometimes not recognized within the broader American corporate.
Mr. Chang, you've mentioned earlier about trying to understand real, actual vulnerabilities of Chinese companies, and you used the ZTE example, and I agree with you. I think we should have gone forward and not allowed U.S. components to be used in ZTE, and that would have sent a clear message to the Chinese that we are being serious. Do you have any examples? I know you said one of the things we need to do is actually understand that, and I'm going to take that back to some of my friends to help ensure that we have a better understanding. But do you know of, and can you ID a couple of current vulnerabilities in some of these Chinese companies that maybe be some items that this committee can take up or even other legislators take on and move with?
I don't know if this is within the purview of this committee, but let me give a different example. CCCC dredging. CCCC is a Chinese state-owned enterprise. The Chinese, as they're doing South China Sea land reclamation, which of course has also been in the news, as they're building these new islands, it is not the Chinese military that's going out there. It's not the Chinese Ministry of Interior. They go to their own state-owned enterprises and say, you, go and dredge up all the coral, doesn't matter what the environmental impact is, dredge up thousands of tons of coral and build this new island. Many of those companies are using specialized dredging equipment that has not been manufactured in China. So therefore, they are going to European, American, foreign companies buying specialized equipment, dredger hoppers, equipment like that, to basically destroy the environment of the South China Sea and build strategically important islands. Operating in a maritime environment, as any maritime engineer will tell you, also I should note here I'm not one of those either, is a very harsh environment. Things break. That means spare parts have to be purchased from abroad. which means CCCC dredging is basically employing imported equipment to alter the situation in the South China Sea. Why we would allow that to continue, given the strategic importance of that region, is problematic, in my opinion. A third area is, basically speaking, and this goes directly to monetary issues, why do the Chinese list on foreign stock exchanges? They list on foreign stock exchanges for two reasons. One, obviously access to capital, but two, because it is a de facto, again, endorsement of the company. The Chinese play up the idea that if they are allowed to list on the New York Stock Exchange, then they have fulfilled U.S. SEC requirements. The bizarre part is that sometimes these companies are partly state-owned enterprises, which have an opacity to them. But again, they are nonetheless at times allowed to list on our stock exchanges.
Mr. Newf, we're going to get back to you in round two, and I'm going to defer now and recognize Robin Kelly for a second round of questions.
Thank you. Something that's always a big concern to me, and part of it is when I go back to my district and I visit my companies, they always talk about the lack of a qualified workforce. And can you guys talk about this in that arena, that because of immigration or because of lack of investment in education or training and those kind of things, how I know we feel it now, but it seems like we're going to feel it even more in the future. I don't mean to look at you, but you
Can I
go.
start? Thank you. So a couple of things. First of all, electrical engineers drive the semiconductor industry. These are the guys, electrical and chemical engineers, these are the guys who make semiconductors. A lot of these young kids coming into this profession like to go off and make the coolest app and work for big internet companies. So there's a bit of a problem there. But a bigger problem is that our government does not have a big enough emphasis on promoting STEM education. And our immigration policy is broken so that we can't get the numbers of STEM employees from overseas that we need. And if you go to any semiconductor company, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of job openings for STEM applicants. So there needs to be a remedy. These are huge systemic problems and riven with controversy. But until we get to the bottom of this, our industry, semiconductor industry, is at risk because you got to have the talent to build these incredibly innovative semiconductors and stay at the tip of the technology spear. Yes.
I'm on the board of trustees of the college I graduated from, and then I'm on an advisory from the other college I graduated from. And it's amazing when I was at the graduation for one of the colleges, the lack of international students in engineering. I mean, it was unbelievable, the change. And both colleges talked about how they're just not even getting the applications.
Interesting.
When it comes to foreign students, one source that you probably do not have a shortage of is Chinese. China represents approximately 1/3 of the current foreign student population in the United States, many of which are in STEM. The problem is that many of these students, the question becomes, what is it they are coming here to study? They are studying STEM, obviously, but are they staying? Or are they here particularly focused on programs which will have dual use and military benefit and then going home? We have seen a generational shift within the context of Chinese students. In the past, many of them tended to stay here. This is also true abroad, that is to say in Europe and elsewhere. But more and more of those students seem to be going home. Whether that's due to economic opportunities at home or due to pressure is much less clear. I certainly would not disagree that this country needs more engineers and more STEM students in general. But I would highlight that simply because you are getting an education in a STEM field does not any longer mean that you are in fact getting STEM education. There are professors who apparently are teaching math courses whose focus is on the fundamental underlying racism and sexism of math. Now, how that will help produce better electrical and aerospace engineers is beyond me. But I do think that if we are going to focus on STEM, that we need to be focused on actually producing people who can produce 5 nanometer circuit wafers, who can produce better rocket engines for Blue Origin, War, ULA, who can produce, better systems engineering and quantum computing, and not necessarily engaged in whether or not, a focus on math is somehow giving way to some of our worst historical habits.
Thank you.
Thank you. I just also would be remiss if I didn't use this opportunity to thank you both for this excellent report that you both released, I guess, yesterday on AI. We at ITF really applaud it and think it's exactly in the right direction, so thank you.
Thank you.
I just want to quickly come back to the prior comment from Congressman Hurd. I think one of the challenges with this, one of the challenges with this issue is I don't want to say complete, but pretty serious lack of knowledge in the U.S. government. We don't know the answer to your question, and we should know that. And it's partly because we simply don't have an institutional home for that level of global supply chain analysis, and I think we have to have that. Congresswoman, with regard to your question, I actually think this is a much easier solution than people think. It tends to be framed as how do we convince a bunch of fourth graders to somehow like STEM. We've done a lot of research on this. We've come out with a fairly comprehensive strategy. There are lots of kids who like it. We don't give them enough of the right opportunity. So one of the things that we've proposed and supported, more specialty math in high schools, particularly in disadvantaged communities. They play an incredibly effective role in getting kids who might not otherwise be into that. They go to college. A good example of that is the San Antonio Math and Science High School, the Dallas Math and Science High School. 90 to 95% Hispanic and black students, almost 100. In fact, I think their rate of getting AP exams, 5s on the AP exams, exceeds most high schools in the country right now. Secondly, at college level, we know that one of the big problems is colleges could take more and have more students go through that, but they intentionally limit the slots in computer science and engineering. They force people to leave the discipline who want to stay and are good students. And that's a budget issue and an incentive issue. And I think the federal government can provide more incentives to get universities to focus on it. University of Washington, a good example, the CS department head, I talked to him. I asked him how many slots they could add without reducing ability, without quality. He said we could double the number of Washington State students in our CS department, but we aren't given the budget to do it.
We actually started a STEM academy in my district just with my office exposing 6th, 7th, and 8th graders to different things that they could do with the STEM career. But of course, it's hard to keep up because we're just a little office. But I know we piqued the interest and just trying to give opportunity and broaden their horizon. So thank you, thank you.
Picking up on the issue of education, roughly 40% of the people that are actually in STEM education and master's and PhD programs in the United States are Chinese. And so my question is the United States has benefited from the brain drain of every other country for the last couple of decades. Let's continue that. When you're at 3.8% unemployment, that means every industry needs people, whether it's agriculture or artificial intelligence. When you're at multiple quarters of 4% growth, rising wages, rising average income, the thing that can stall the economy is not having the proper workforce to take advantage of these opportunities. 2 ways to do that: grow our own. We've talked about that, something that we got to continue to do, but it's also through immigration. And you have people that are coming here and getting PhDs, masters, and they're having difficulty in getting the right visa in order to stay here and continue to work for U.S. companies. And so my question is the opportunity of having a smart person from somewhere else stay here and start a company here and be involved here, does that outweigh potential counterintelligence concerns about this being something directed by the larger government, by the Chinese government? Who would like to start that out? Mr. Atkinson, let's go ahead and go with you.
I don't think we know the answer to that, honestly. You're right on both sides of that. The Chinese students who come here and get a STEM graduate degree and then stay are of value to the U.S. economy and to our innovation system. I think one thing we could do and should do more is I think our universities tend to have a blind eye towards threats. There's a famous case at Duke University where Chinese students came, enrolled in a PhD program, and essentially took the cloaking, this was Defense Department, the cloaking technology. They took it. This was a few years ago, and so the Duke wasn't aware of it, and they hadn't thought about it. We need to make sure, through the FBI counterintelligence efforts, we need to make sure that every university has procedures and processes in place to at least limit that, so they're aware of it.
So going on that, Mr. Atkinson, I'm gonna ask a broader question. Look, when you look at the amount of venture capital that has been deployed in Chinese companies, the amount of Chinese capital being deployed in, let's call it broader Silicon Valley, do those companies recognize the national security threat of the investment that is coming from potential Chinese investors?
No.
There it is.
The lion's share have no concern or interest. They just want the money.
Ms. Cook, I know there's two questions there.
Yeah,
Answer them both, one, neither.
I would just go back to Mr. Chung's previous point about the way the Chinese government looks at foreign political influence. It doesn't always necessarily separate the kind of military counterintelligence or things that we would look at as being more aggressive with softer forms of influence. And I think from that perspective, a lot of the Chinese students here are victims themselves in many ways of pressures, of consular officials sitting in on meetings of the Chinese student associations at U.S. universities. If you look especially at the Chinese...
You're saying Chinese consular officials in the United States at a U.S.
meeting.
student
So, for
group
example,
with
yes,
Chinese students at a U.S. university.
Yes, so it might not be the full meeting. It might be just certainly one specific anecdote that I heard from a Chinese student. This was a number of years ago, so it's getting a little more attention now, related to elections within a university, and one of the women who was trying to stand for election at this Chinese Students Scholar Associations happened to practice Falun Gong. And the consular officials basically went around the table of the specific officers or students and applied other pressures basically to pressure the students in that association not to elect her. And other ways in which there's been a series of articles and investigations recently, especially in foreign policy, I think, about the way the Chinese diplomats influence Chinese student associations in the United States. Some of it's with funding, some of it is with actual reporting requirements and things like that. And again, these students, this is not without force behind it. I mean, I think we have to, again, it's very tricky because a lot of times the students are themselves, they have family in China, and the Chinese government is very adept at pressuring family to get people abroad to do things. And so I think that's a threat to the safety and well-being of the Chinese students at American universities that American universities aren't dealing with, but also comes back to this bigger question of the way in which the Chinese diplomats and Chinese officials exert pressure on individuals here in the United States, and potential actions that the U.S. government could do. Because those same diplomats will also go and pressure an advertiser who they see advertising in a local dissident Chinese newspaper in New York City. Or will go and threaten a journalist who has family back in China who's working for Radio Free Asia or things like that. And the U.S. government has been, in some cases, there's real evidence about this, and there isn't a strong response. There isn't a démarche. There isn't. I mean, these are violations of diplomatic conventions. So, I mean, I think that, again, this question of the way in which Chinese embassies and consular officials are able to have communication and exert pressure on Chinese students ultimately can have very important counterintelligence ramifications, because it's not that necessarily the Chinese students are coming here ahead of time deciding to try to steal technologies. The Chinese government has the avenues and the power to put them and their families under tremendous pressure. Sure. So being able to find a way in the United States to actually enforce our laws and stop that type of behavior has both national security implications and student welfare implications for the Chinese students as well.
Ms. Cook, you and many of your panelists have commented on something that I've seen. the U.S. intelligence community views intelligence differently than the Chinese view intelligence, and I would say using our vernacular, the intelligence bar for China is significantly lower than what it is for us, and therefore, even though the Chinese believe they're involved in intelligence operations, people on the U.S. side do not believe it's an intelligence operation because that is not how we see or view that, and that is a disconnect from being able to have the information and collection on some of these behaviors of Chinese diplomats and in our country, and so highlighting this is important. Mr. Ching.
So several points, sir. With regards to the very different view of what intelligence constitutes, we have interesting examples of ship visits to China where a series of fourth graders each went up to American sailors and asked interesting questions, not like, what's it like to be an American sailor, but what is the sonar frequency of your dipping sonar? A fourth grader, who would then promptly go back to the school teacher who'd led them and say, oh, the sailor said it was this. And after about 4 questions along these lines, the American sailors were finally told, you should stop answering their questions, that these are not just innocent questions from fourth graders. I do want to emphasize here that there is a danger, of course, in viewing every Chinese student as a potential agent, that we do not want to go to a point where we are simply concluding based on ethnicity or national origin that people are.
And thank you for making that point. And I would add, and correct me if I'm wrong, not all Chinese investment is necessarily a indication that this is going to lead to some draconian issue in the motherland.
No, I would agree with that as well, because there is absolutely a profit motive also at work. Chinese entrepreneurs, like entrepreneurs everywhere, want to make money, want return on investment. That being said, of course, the government is more than happy nonetheless, and it has a vast array of tools to pressure students, entrepreneurs, venture capitalists to pony up information, whether it's on projects that a professor is an advisor is working on, or whether it's new technologies that you're investing in. This goes to a broader CFIUS-related issue. CFIUS, of course, is vital, but CFIUS is a gatekeeper. It is our guard at the perimeter. And the problem, whether it is Confucius Institutes, whether it is students working for professors on advanced projects at universities, whether it is venture capital in Silicon Valley, the Route 128 corridor in Massachusetts, or outside Austin, all has the same issue, which is if you've made it past that, there is much less internal policing, if you will. It's not that CFIUS is bad or is not enough. It is that CFIUS is not enough, but we should not be adding to CFIUS's burden. We probably need a new approach to thinking about what happens.
So do you think FIRMA was adding more burden to CFIUS, or was that a move in the right direction? This is the legislation we recently passed in order to give CFIUS deals over transfer of critical technology, of potential investments in critical technology.
I think the idea behind it is vital and essential, sir. I have to admit that I'm not sure whether or not making CFIUS the party responsible is the best approach, not without expanding its staffing and purview. But I think that effort identified a key shortcoming, not in CFIUS per se, but in our broader technology defense, if you will. The last aspect here is simply to note that the issue of active interference within universities. We have seen this by Confucius Institutes. We've seen this by Chinese agents. The previous administration admonished the Chinese about the improper activity of various officials. That was at best tepid, but it was at least a first step. We do need, in terms of reciprocity, making very clear to the Chinese that their actions will have serious consequences, not just an admonishment, but whether it means PNG to officials, whether it means curtailing their activities and where they can travel, much like we have still imposed on Russian officials and counterparts. But again, going to the broader information-related issues, not just IT. Why is it that the Chinese can limit the presence of a VOA and other reporters to one or two, to cover an entire country the size of the United States. But there can be a good dozen Xinhua bureaus with freedom of travel across the United States.
Mr. Newfer, staff's getting uncomfortable, which always means we've been going on too long. So, let me end, and this is a question for all of our panelists. You got one more? I am going to yield to my friend, Ms. Kelly.
It just takes one word answer from each of you. I know we're talking about China, but what country is behind China? With the concerns we have about China, what other country would you say we need to be concerned about? If there's two, that's fine, but.
India.
Ms. Cook?
I think still probably Russia for the issues that we're looking at, Russia and Iran.
Okay,
I'd agree with Ms. Cook, Russia and Iran.
okay,
And I'll say Russia and India to mix it up.
okay. Thank you. I'm just curious. Thank you.
So, Mr. Newfer, and we'll start with you, and we'll end. Mr. Atkinson, you can have the last word, so make it good. One statement on something else we can be doing other than tariffs. Mr. Ching has given us several. Don't allow Chinese companies on the New York Stock Exchange. We have Ms. Cook's comments about reintroducing and passing the Global Online Freedom Act. What is something that I can turn to our teams and say, hey, what's the reality? Can we get this done? What do we need to do to make this happen? That's what I'm looking for, something short, something tight. All of our staff's pencils are sharpened and ready. Mr. Newfer?
Excellent. One, as Rob said, it's not the only solution, but we should be driving more of our problems into the WTO. It takes time, but we usually win in that fora, and the Chinese respect and are desperate to keep the WTO alive these days. Two, let's get more regional trade agreements. The TPP was very important for our industry. We were sad that it didn't go forward, and it plays a very important role of setting a model for how China and others should behave in the trade arena. Three, we need to be embracing our allies much more often and much more deeply, as Mr. Atkinson says. I've been involved in a number of very contentious issues with China, and we worked with our allies very closely, and we're able to push China back. China does not like to be isolated. And three, we have to have a very, very strong affirmative agenda. And that affirmative agenda, for us, needs to focus on pedaling faster, and to pedal faster, we need this U.S. government investing more heavily in basic research, in tech and our sector.
Good copy. Mr. Ching, you're now, and you don't have to repeat the ones you've already said, because I've gotten those down.
Okay. On the issue of stolen technologies, we should be treating stolen technology like stolen technology, which is to say you are trafficking in stolen goods, we will therefore punish you for doing so. That opens the door then to RICO, to basically criminal conspiracies, which then places the onus on American subsidiaries and their executives to demonstrate that they are not engaging in the trafficking of stolen goods, which puts them then on our side. I want these people to be doing good business. There's nothing wrong with competition. But if you are trafficking in stolen goods, then it's not just your company that will be punished. You're going to lose that nice house, the 3 cars, and the horse.
And we know a few people that are pretty good at handling RICO cases.
Yes, sir. The other thing is just an area of importance, the Internet of Things. If you're worried about artificial intelligence, if you're worried about that, that is a giant data swamp. And the IT security associated with IoT at this point is beyond primitive. I mean, pretty much non-existent. We need to be thinking about setting standards. We need to be thinking about also limiting the amount of data flow from IoT, your coffee maker, your refrigerator, back to China.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Cook.
I think we need to, and I think we actually can, punch quite a big hole in the Great Firewall. We work with circumvention tool developers to get some of our content on censorship that we translate into Chinese to Chinese users. And we get the data, millions of people in a week span, not just one tool, accessing it. Another tool that's on actual mobile phones, which are becoming more, which is the main way Chinese people work, also, they get to a landing page and content related from Freedom House, content from Radio Free Asia, Voice of America, but also, of course, Google Ads, Facebook. Those are the first places people go. And the U.S. government has invested tens of millions of dollars in internet freedom projects around the world. And if you look generally, working on circumvention tools isn't necessarily the answer in every country because the tactics are different. And even in China, it goes through waves. But right now, there's a real demand after VPNs have been taken off of Apple's iPhone store. I spoke to, before this hearing, a number of circumvention tool developers who have received U.S. funding in the past, but for various reasons, it seemed to indicate a certain degree of mismanagement, to use their words. They're not being used as effectively. There's an emphasis in some cases on developing new tools as opposed to scaling up tools that are being effective and could be scaled up more widely. That's why I would urge the committee, and I can connect the staffers to relevant people, to take a look, to speak to people at the BBG, people at the State Department, specifically regarding the China portion. Because for other countries that don't have a firewall, you need other solutions. But in China, I think there's a real question how this funding has been dispersed, whether it should be increased, but could be managed and get to people more effectively. Because if, one of the developers was saying, these Chinese companies are spending billions of dollars, like the amount of money per user on censoring people, if he had even the fraction of that, he could actually provide, again, access to so many more people. And so think about what an alternative future would be. If you have innovation in that area, and one of the ideas he said was, don't just have separate circumvention apps. Have circumventions programmed into existing apps. Then you've got Chinese users going and visiting. Google doesn't have to compromise its values because you've got at least a certain market share of Chinese users jumping the firewall. And again, this is, I think there are reasons to believe why this could be possible from a technological perspective without an enormous expense necessarily to taxpayers. So I think that's what we would urge to really look at.
That's a good copy and very helpful. Mr. Atkinson, you have the final word. Make it tight, make it good.
I can make it tight. I don't know about making it good. We issued a report last year where we laid out a very comprehensive non-tariff agenda. There's a whole lot of ideas in there. Let me suggest three quickly. One, enact a regime where Chinese entities who seek technology licenses in the U.S. have to essentially get that license on the same terms that they force our companies to license in China. So reciprocity around technology licensing. I would just limit and most U.S.-China S&T cooperation. I don't see any reason why we have any cooperative agreements with the Chinese when it comes to science and technology. And third, I would spend more money on customs enforcement. There's a lot of Chinese counterfeit goods that still get in this country, and that's a good way to make them suffer pain. They go to produce the product, they send it all the way over there, and then we burn it or throw it in the ocean, and that sends them a very clear message. So
that was very good. Thank you. And I want to thank all the witnesses for appearing before us today. The hearing record is going to remain open for 2 more weeks for any member to submit a opening statement or questions for the record. And if there's no further business without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.
thank you.